In fiction, communicate truth. Is a novel somehow a vehicle for communicating or taking readers into the emotional heart of a conflict? Hi, I'm Joel Rosenberg. I'm in Denver today, not in Jerusalem. I'm visiting with my elderly parents who are not doing so well right now. So my wife and I have come to care for them for a bit. But I want to talk to my friend, Ruth Eglash, who is a great journalist and is a friend, and she's in Jerusalem. And so normally we would, in ideal circumstances, we would be sitting together in Jerusalem having this conversation, because Ruth is not only a great journalist, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, but she has taken her first step in writing a novel about the incredibly emotional and explosive conflict in Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, through the lenses of three teenage girls. It's a great concept. It's a very, very good book. Ruth, great to be with you. How are you? I'm sorry we're not sitting together, in the shuk having coffee, filming this.
No, it's great to be here. It's actually a very tense day in Israel. If you're following the news, I know you just spoken up there, Joel, but it's been a very tense day. And yes, I've been covering this country. I've been a journalist here for more than 20 years. And just like you say, maybe I just had enough of the conflicts, and I needed an escape, and so I chose fiction. But it's not actually an escape, as you just said. It can actually be used to send a very strong message and really reach out to people and really get them to listen to what's at stake here.
Well, I appreciate this, and I want to go into that more in a moment. But let's start with the news. First, what's going on in Israel, in Jerusalem, as well as U.S.-Israel relations, because this is a big week. Obviously, Israeli President Isaac Herzog coming to Washington to deliver the second only joint address to a joint session of Congress, but also the fact that we just have had the news in the last 24 hours that President Joe Biden has called Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and finally issued an invitation for them to meet. We don't have details, as far as I'm aware, quite yet, but it'll be later this year, possibly on the sidelines of the UN. But let's start with what's going on in Jerusalem itself, because it's current, but also it'll set up how you've been covering this conflict for so long and why you went into fiction. But first, what's the news of the day right there?
Well, this is what they call Yom Shibushim, or a day of unrest in Israel. And I will say most of the protests up until now have been happening outside of Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in central locations across the country. A day of disruption. The people who feel that the current government and some of its policies are a threat to their lives and to their democracy, and to the nature of the country as it exists right now. And what's going on in the Knesset, which is in Jerusalem, the parliament, is that the coalition members in Netanyahu's government are determined to pass through a law or a series of laws that will reform the judiciary. And that feels very threatening for some people here. So there's really, we're gearing up towards, I think, for the next few weeks, some serious clashes between Israelis. Forget about the wider conflicts that are in the region. We're looking at a real conflict, a real turmoil in Israeli society. And, like I said, I've been based in Jerusalem for the last 20 plus years, and I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen such anger and such tension between different sectors in Israeli society.
Yeah, that is astonishing in many ways, because normally in a normal weird world, if you and I were talking about a clash or tensions in Jerusalem, you'd be saying that, the Palestinian street is up in arms. Israel has, killed somebody, or there's been a terrorist attack against Israel or something. And now we're talking about Israeli Jews against Israeli Jews with tremendous passion, tremendous anger. And it's not the subject of our interview today, but it shows how complex and how how many different stories one has to cover. You were born and raised in London, I believe, right?
Yes.
You're
Yeah,
British, but you're British Israeli.
I was born and raised in London. My father's Israeli. He was born in Israel, and but I was born in London, in the heart of London, and I moved here just over 20 years ago, actually more now, 25 years ago. And I've been working here as a journalist ever since I arrived. First for the Jerusalem Post, I spent 13 years there, and then later
working your way up from like just literally like entry level almost. I think to deputy managing editor, right?
I said, actually, a young journalist approached me a couple of days ago and said, how do I get into journalism? I said, do whatever they ask you to do. Go out and cover even the lowest stories, just always be available to do that. So that's really how I started. I actually started as a graphic designer and a layout editor and writing stories on the sideline. Whatever anyone else didn't want to write, I would go out and cover. And I worked my way up over 13 years to become first of all, the arts and entertainment editor, then the social welfare reporter. Then I created the first social media, policy for the Jerusalem Post. And then I became deputy managing editor there. And I left roughly 10 years ago. I freelanced for all different, international outlets, and then was hired by the Washington Post in 2013.
And you were there for 7 years, I think it was?
8 years I was there for,
okay.
and covered very, very closely the different conflicts in Israel, although that I did more when I was at the Jerusalem Post, and also the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And I feel very privileged, actually, that I had my status as a journalist and as a British citizen that allowed me to go into areas of the Palestinian Authority where many Israelis are afraid to go, or they stay away from, or they're not welcomed. And I was able to go into those places and meet with Palestinians. And on the other hand, I'm a fluent Hebrew speaker. I was able to interview Israelis on their level and hear from them as well about how this ongoing conflict here affects both sides. And I feel very privileged that I had access to that.
Well, it helps set up your novel really well, and we'll get to that in a moment. But you're writing for Jewish Insider, which, as the name would imply, and some of our evangelical, readers and watchers will not be familiar with it, but is almost a boutique news site, newsletter focused on things that will be particularly Jewish, of Jewish interest. And obviously in the United States, but particularly in Israel. So you're bringing a lot of important coverage to this world. I love Jewish Insider, by the way, because it does give me insight into the Jewish world from several different angles than I would normally get by reading any other coverage. So as much as I'd love to talk about your journalism career, we're going to talk about this novel, but let's just do one other thing. So we got this tension in Israel over the judicial reform bill, which they're sort of salami slicing into bits now to see if they can get it passed in pieces, since they weren't able to get it passed as a whole package. But we also have Herzog in Washington. Why don't you just take a moment and talk about what are you watching? What do you think are the key things to watch for? What are you anticipating with the Herzog visit? What does he need to accomplish?
Well, I think that you need to frame the Herzog visit, first of all, because, the fact that Herzog was the president of Israel, which is a ceremonial position, was invited to the White House before the sitting prime minister. Netanyahu is the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, but he was ousted out of power in 2021, and he's now back in power. He returned to power at the end of last year, and he still hasn't received an invitation to the White House to meet with Joe Biden. And before, largely because of this judicial overhaul, because of these plans to make some key reforms to the judiciary here. So we have to look at the president's visit, President Herzog's visit to Washington, in that framework, through that lens, that it's sending a message to Netanyahu. It's sending a message first of all, to the Israeli people, that the relationship between the United States and Israel is unbreakable, that it's solid, that there's still a strong relationship there that's lasted for many decades, and it's gonna last regardless of who is in power. But it's also sending a message to Netanyahu and to his government that this administration in the White House is not very fond of these changes that the government here is trying to make, that they don't approve of them, that I'm still wondering, and maybe you can answer this, Joel, if this disapproval is the changes itself or the fact that the changes have caused such dissension in Israeli society. And when you look from the outside of what's going on here, and these protests are so emotional, and you see people blocking central highways in the middle of Tel Aviv, and people burning tires and waving flags and singing patriotic songs. And now today we're hearing members of the Army Reserve's key positions in the army who are refusing to serve. You wonder whether the administration is more anxious about the reforms or more anxious about the fact that there is such a division in Israeli society that in a way that's never been seen before.
Yeah, and I don't want to get into it too much because we've been doing a lot of coverage. You've been doing a lot of coverage, and we'll continue to do it. But I will say, since you brought it up, I disagree with what Biden is doing here. I understand it's instinct, but it's the wrong approach in my view. And the reason is because he has no problem with engaging with the leadership of Iran. He has no problem with dealing obviously with China or whomever else. What the signal is not to Netanyahu. The signal is to Tehran. The signal is to Moscow. The signal is to Damascus and Beirut. What you're saying is there's such division between America's closest ally and the United States administration that we won't even let him in the building. This is not the way to first of all, it's not the way to influence Netanyahu because he's digging in his heels. And it sends a dangerous message in a dangerous region. So I think it's a wrong approach. I think it's better to keep your friends close and your enemies closer, to just do a little Godfather this morning. But so I think it's a mistake. And I think to do a press conference in the White House with Netanyahu and then Biden makes his case on whatever he wants to say, fine, say it and let Netanyahu say his. That's an ally working together. But let's get into the novel, because what we're doing is setting up this interview in really in many ways is showing that you've got 20 years of covering from multiple publications, from multiple angles, over multiple conflicts and sub-conflicts within the Israeli society, within the Palestinian society, Arab-Israeli, Palestinian-Israeli. But then you took a unique decision for yourself, which is, how do I tell this story to my children or to young people in particular? Maybe not children. I mean, we're talking about teenagers, but you wrote almost the Hunger Games of Israel. How do young people, and in this case, 3 teenage girls, and a secular Israeli, a religious Israeli girl, a Jewish girl, and then a Palestinian Arab Muslim girl from Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. How do they see the conflict? How does one explain the conflict, not in 700 to 1,000 words in a news story and headline, but how do we get into the emotional heart of this conflict to understand it better? Because I think most people know that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is important, but most people think it's so complicated, I wouldn't even know where to start. And I do believe fiction is a way. It's not the only way, but it's a very creative way of taking people inside a story that they know they should understand, but they don't want to read maybe a 500-page nonfiction book about all the intricacies of the history. It just seems too dry, too inaccessible. So talk about you deciding to write a novel, Parallel Lines. We'll get to the title in a moment, but just why did you write this novel, and why did you think, yes, I can do this, even though that's not your background, you're not your world?
Well, first of all, I didn't think I could do it, and
Oh, okay.
every time I
That's
see the
humble.
novel, I'm quite surprised, and it was a challenge to switch from a narrative style, which is journalism, where you explain things and you have this authoritative voice, and you have to, give the hard, cold facts as much as you can, and to switch to a more emotional, emotive, descriptive style of writing, and that was a challenge after so long of writing in
Wow.
a journalism style.
Most
But
people can't do it, but you
it was
showed that you
hard.
can.
It was a hard switch. And second of all, I'll say, this book, I think you hit the nail on the head. It actually did not start out as a young adult novel. It started out as I wanted to explain the conflict. And, when I was at college, and this is going to probably give my age away, and I don't know if I really want to, but
Don't worry, I'm older than you,
when
but
when I was at college and I was a journalism major, as close as you can get in the UK, I was sent to cover an aspect of the war in Bosnia. And there were refugees living near my college. And I wanted to do some background research. And I realized it was such a complicated conflict that if you just pick up a newspaper and you start reading a story, you have no idea of what this conflict is about, where it started, who started it, why it started, what is going on, who is right, who is wrong. And I feel very much the same with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So when I started writing Parallel Lines, I thought, okay, I want to really explain it in a way that people who are interested in this topic will be able to understand it. And I thought, what better way than to do it through the eyes of young people, of teenagers, because children have a way, or young people have a way of explaining things in simple terms. And so that's why I chose my protagonist to be aged 16. And a few people along the way gave me some advice. They said, don't write a young adult novel. There's not going to be any interest in Israel in the young adult, fiction world. They're only interested in science fiction and other, more like, hip topics, and they're not going to be interested in Israel. Why don't you make your protagonists, 19, 20, 21? And I said, well, that's impossible, because at the age of 18, there is a divergent style in society here. And as you know, young Israelis at the age of 18, young secular Israelis go into the army. More Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox women often end up getting married around that age. And
right. Life changes big and big time. Yeah, yeah.
And young Arab women, young Arabs, they don't have to serve in the army, so they go to university. So they wouldn't be at the same stage. So the protagonists needed to have this symmetry. They needed to be the same age, and the last age where they would have parallel lines would be age 16. So the book ended up being young adult, but I think that it is an excellent introduction, if I might say so myself, to people who really want to understand the conflict, who really want to get a good basis and see up close what it's really like to live in a city that is always tense, that is always has this background to the conflict. As I was researching this book, Joel, I obviously, I have 3 children who were born in Israel. And around the time that I started writing it, my 2 oldest were teenagers. And so a lot of the Jewish secular character of Tamar is based on my daughter, who at the time was studying right in the center of Jerusalem, in a school really in the heart of Western Jerusalem, I would say, like 5 minutes from the old city. And she was seeing with her own eyes the conflict unfolding around her, and she had many, many questions for me. So I was in this weird situation where, on the one hand, I was explaining the conflict through my articles for the Washington Post.
Right.
It was being read by millions of people. And on the other hand, I had this, 13-year-old daughter who was coming home and asking me questions about suspicious packages, stabbing attacks, who would try to kill someone else. Why would they do that? And I had to explain to her in a very sensitive way. So the book was really...
Was she reading your articles?
No, no, no. She was very innocent, you know. It came from very much a place of innocence, and she wanted to understand, you know, why suddenly there were soldiers, you know, on the train telling everyone to get off, and they were, you know, building a perimeter around a bag that was left there, and you know what all of that meant, and there were other conflicts in Jerusalem too. I mean, now we're talking about the conflicts between, we're talking about a political, you know, division, but there's conflicts between religious and secular Jews in Jerusalem, in Israel, and specifically in Jerusalem too. So she would be asking me lots of questions, and she's relentless. She doesn't give up. So I had to answer her question.
Maybe a future journalist.
No, I don't think so. But she, you know, so it was really based on her. And as I spoke to her and her friends about their views and how they saw what was happening around them, I realized, you know, there's these other groups, and I'm sure that the teenagers from those groups have some interesting insights too. So that's when I started talking to young Palestinian Muslims or East Jerusalemites. I started talking to Haredi girls from Mea Shearim, which is the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods of Jerusalem. And I really wanted to understand how they view the other and how they view the conflict. It's an adult conflict, and
yeah, it's true, and I think it's a fascinating decision that I haven't actually seen before. I mean, maybe it's been done, but I haven't ever actually read a novel that took something as complicated as this and said, let's dial down the age and ask similar but distinctly different questions from a different for different reasons, and try to understand the angle of these three entirely different young girls. Explain, and I think this is really interesting, your title, Parallel Lines, and you just referenced it. Why don't you explain why you chose that title? What does it mean?
So, you know, what fascinated me most as I started talking to these young women is that, you know, first of all, teenage girls are, you know, they have similarities. They share many of the same things. It's an age where you're starting to recognize the world, you're starting to look at the world around you. But on the other hand, you have, you know, and in normal circumstances, these young girls who, in my book, they live less than a mile apart from each other in a specific part of Jerusalem that I'm sure that you're familiar with, you know, in the northern suburbs. Mm-hmm. And yet there's no chance for them to meet. And that has really fascinated me because Israelis, as you probably know, always talk about this, you know, united capital of Israel, which is Jerusalem. And when you're here on the ground, it feels anything but united. If you look around you, you see these different groups. And in 2015, President Reuven Rivlin, gave a seminal speech about the tribes of Israel and how he was worried about this division in Israeli society. And I think in Jerusalem, and especially in that area of Jerusalem, you have, it's very, very obvious what he's referring to. And you have these different groups who live side by side, but they are completely apart, and they have different customs, different culture, different language, even different ways of dressing. And that really fascinated me. And I really wanted to put these three young women who were going through all the angst, usual angst of your teenage years, and yet they were living in these three different worlds. And it was very important to me to keep the worlds separate and not say, oh, well, look, suddenly they became friends, because that is not realistic in Jerusalem. There is no...
In one sense, it's both... I mean, to me, it was like both the train tracks themselves, that these girls would end up riding the train, but the parallel lines by definition don't ever cross, they don't converge. And so I think it's an interesting image to describe the life of a lot of Israelis in Jerusalem.
And the irony, I mean, this is the other thing, the irony, the title is an irony in a way, but like you just said, because these communities their paths do not cross. They live in separate worlds, separate parallel universes, but yet there are places in Jerusalem where their lives converge, and one of those things is the light rail, is the train line, which is a fairly new development in Jerusalem. It hasn't been there more than 10 years, but it runs through all the neighborhoods. So as part of my research, I sat on the train, and you see each community getting on and off the train in different places, in different areas, and there are small pockets where everyone's together. And they're together but apart, and it just struck me. I mean, it took me a while to come up with the title, but I think it really.
Good choice. No, seriously, I think it's a good choice, a great choice actually, because for this exact reason, you're first of all, it doesn't immediately invoke Jerusalem, and yet once you understand what the story is, you realize these things could converge, but they're not, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, no, and there are also many scenes that take place in the hospitals in Jerusalem, which are also this amazing kind of microcosm of the city, but are an excellent example of coexistence. I mean, you have patients, sickness impacts everyone in the same way. And so you have the hospitals that are filled with, Jewish, Muslim, ultra-Orthodox patients. You have Jewish, Muslim, ultra-Orthodox doctors and nurses, and everyone works together. And it's like one of the only places, I think, in the city, if not in Israel, where you have these different communities where they connect together and work together and interact with each other. So, I wanted to show it. And I think that the irony of the title is that there's so many ironies, there's so many nuances in Jerusalem. When, like you mentioned it before, when you write a story for a newspaper, you have 800, 700, 800 words, you have a headline, you have to include quotes and context and background and historic and a bit of historical reference. You don't have space to put in this color, this nuance. And that is where I found myself when I started writing it, that I had all these stories. I'd heard all these stories from all the different sides, and I thought, okay, I need to get these stories out, and I need to show, what it's really like to live in Jerusalem.
My only disappointment, but I don't really mean this, but I'm just going to say it as a Christian, would be, it's too bad there wasn't a fourth girl, because, and especially now, although that's a fairly newer thing, the Christians are often living in a parallel universe as well. I think Christians may be, generally speaking, at least evangelicals, working harder to try to get to know their Jewish and Muslim, secular and Jewish, religious Jewish, friends and neighbors, but that's not always successful. And there's been a lot of tension, of course, in Jerusalem in particular in the last year or two. I think that's spiking. So I don't mean literally that would be a world that you would open up into, and you can only do so much in a novel. But let's close this interview, which I'm enjoying so much. I wish it could go longer. But talk about why a Christian reader, an evangelical reader in particular, might find your book particularly interesting, because I'm guessing you haven't been doing Christian interviews so far, right? You're Jewish, you work for Jewish Insider, right? And I'm sure that so far, all the interviews I've read, Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, Jerusalem Insider, and others have been, and they've been wonderful. I think you're doing a great job as a new novelist, crossing a line from the world of fact into fiction. But I'm just curious, why do you think evangelical readers, particularly younger readers, maybe teenagers themselves and their parents, might find this book interesting?
Well, Joel, this is not the first time a Christian person has raised this with me since my novel came out a few weeks ago. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a Christian presence in Jerusalem, but I think it's more than that. I think Israel has millions of Christian supporters. I think many, contrary to the incidents that you just mentioned, the tension and we've seen graffiti, racist graffiti and even attacks, physical attacks on Christian clergy in Jerusalem. I think regardless of that, I think many Israelis and many Jews are very thankful for the support of the Christian community towards Israel, especially in the United States. I covered it very closely for the Washington Post when I worked there, and that was during the Trump administration. And
That's how you and I met.
yes, that's true. And but I really think that as I mentioned before, I think this book gives a very good basic introduction to someone who really wants to understand the conflict. If you can't visit Jerusalem, if you haven't been here before, but you follow it closely and you hold Jerusalem, which is the holy city for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. If you hold Jerusalem as a sacred place in your heart, and you really want to understand what's happening here, then I think this book can really give you a good basic level understanding. And I also say, even for people who think they understand, even if you have been here and you have a basic understanding of the conflict, and you want to go a little bit deeper, this book can take you really inside people's minds and see how people view it. And maybe, who knows, maybe for my next book, I'll have a Christian character and focus on the role of the Christian community here.
Well, I leave that to you, but I do think you should continue in your work in fiction. There's not that many people who understand the conflict or as well as one can, who are using fiction to try to draw people in. Obviously, I'm always going to be a supporter of that approach because I think most people don't want to be educated. They want to be entertained. And we can war against that at some level, or we can embrace it and say, okay, let's entertain people. You got to grab that person's attention and you got to hold it. And yet you can learn an awful lot. In fact, I would argue you can learn sometimes more through a novel than you can through a newspaper article or whatever. I just have one actual real recommendation, and that is I would encourage you to create this into an audiobook. You may have to do that yourself or something. Oh, good. Because a lot of, again, in this busy, fast-paced culture that we have, a lot of people might say, I would love to read that story. I just don't have the time. But when I'm stuck in traffic, driving to work or taking my kids to school, maybe my kids should be listening to this as I, drive my teenagers to school or whatever. And I get through so many books that I would love to sit down and, sit on the porch, except I don't have really a porch in an American sense, now that I live in Jerusalem. But I get through a lot of books, even, shaving and going to the market. Sure, honey, I'll go get milk. That's 10 more minutes each direction to listen to some novel that I'm interested in. So good. I'm glad you're doing that.
It's in the works. My publisher in Texas actually just updated me today that they found someone to turn it into an audiobook, and I'm very excited about that. So, keep your eyes on Amazon if you like audiobooks, because it's
all right. Let us know, and we'll also let people know when that comes out. Ruth, thank you so much for being with us on All Israel News. I want to encourage you, and I want to encourage my readers and viewers to pick up a copy of Parallel Lines. You can get it on Kindle or in paperback from Amazon. It is a fascinating journey into a world that I obviously care a lot about. And if you're obviously paying attention to All Israel News and our sister site, All Arab News, this is, I think, going to touch you in a different way than most. I mean, we haven't talked much about novels, ironically, on this site. So I think Ruth is taking us into a world in a different way. And I think she's done an amazing job at it. And so, Ruth, congratulations on your debut novel, and I hope it's not your last.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Joel.
It's great to be with you. Thank you so much. This is Joel Rosenberg in Denver, oddly, and Ruth Marks Eglash in Jerusalem. Thank you so much for watching. Please share this video on your social media channels and subscribe to our YouTube channel at All Israel News. God bless you.